Hey everyone, Jonathan here with CT Connect and really excited to be with you here today. We're going to have a really interesting conversation here with Richard Henderson, Chief Sales Officer at HigherLogic, and Paul Ironside, CEO here at CT Connect. Before we get to Richard and Paul, though, let me take a minute to frame a little bit of how we expect to spend the next 30 minutes together. We're going to talk a little bit about kind of this market shift that we're witnessing in terms of moving from growth at all costs to operational excellence, and tee Richard up a little bit as to how he's helping HigherLogic navigate that shift. We'll have a few questions for Richard. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll kind of pull a handful out and fire away at them. And then at the end, we're going to keep you in suspense and we're going to share one tactic that we think everyone on the call can walk away with to improve operational excellence. So with that, let me go ahead and jump us into it and talk a little bit about what we're witnessing in this changing market environment. And, if you've seen headlines like this over the last handful of months, you're certainly not alone. Whether it's rising interest rates or a handful of other headwinds that are hitting tech companies, we're certainly operating in a different environment than we were a handful of months ago. And it's no wonder, as we talk to CROs and other sales leaders, we're just not valuing tech companies the way that we certainly were in the past. And, the idea that it's not just that we're growing, but it's how we're growing that actually matters, I think is front and center for all sales leaders at the moment. And, I think we look at the revenue intelligence space and I think we've seen some real opportunities to improve our operations, whether it's forecasting or our ability to win more deals in our pipeline. This has been certainly over the last few years, whether it's tools like Gong and Clary, real improvements in how we sell that is important right now at the moment in terms of how we go out and run the sales team. And, we look at revenue intelligence, this is a definition from Gartner, capturing seller activity, measuring deal health, and guiding sellers' next action is how Gartner would explain the revenue intelligence space at its essence. And when we contrast that with sales management intelligence, which is what we're going to be talking about today, we look at capturing manager activity, measuring sales team health, because managers don't influence deals, they influence reps who influence deals, and guiding managers' next action. And again, when we get to the end of the conversation today, we're going to talk about one tactic that we think has just as much potential as some of the revenue intelligence tactics that we've hit on previously that can really improve the way that we run our operations within sales organizations today. So again, our mission and what we're here to do is help CROs run the management cadence, and we do that based on where managers are spending time. And I'm going to hand it over to Paul and Richard here in a minute, but as I do that, this is maybe a framework for you to keep in your mind as Paul and Richard have this conversation. And, as you think about this, think about your sales process and certainly all the effort that I'm sure you've put into understanding how that's behaving and how you can make it more efficient, more operationally excellent. And, I don't think you would do that without measuring kind of the inputs that are going in, sales calls, opportunities, et cetera, and how that's translating. And, we believe there's absolutely a similar opportunity when it comes to our management process and where our managers spend their time. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and I'm going to hand it over to Paul and Richard for a conversation. Take it away, guys.
Yeah, Jonathan, thank you. And Richard, I can't thank you enough for taking some time out of your day and joining us here this afternoon or morning, depending on where you are in the country or in the world. Hey, Richard, before we get going, maybe I could just ask you to just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you, your background, HigherLogic, and we'll kind of jump in from there.
Yeah, sure. Great to see you, Paul, and thanks for the invitation today. Great to be here and with the group on the Zoom on the conversation. Richard Henderson, I'm the Chief Sales Officer of HigherLogic. We're an online customer community business. I've been the Chief Sales Officer for the last 4 years within the organization, just over 60 sellers worldwide across the business. Prior to that, have grown up from individual contributor into a variety of sales leadership roles, spent many years at corporate executive board, CEB, and then went into smaller private equity-backed software businesses, had a stint with Vista Equity, one of their portfolio companies, and now working for HigherLogic, which is backed by JMR.
Terrific. Thank you. I know it's a rich, deep background, kind of steeped in sales management and so forth. Hey, Richard, as we kind of climb into it, maybe putting a little bit of context into the conversation this morning, tell us a little bit about the 22 objectives of HigherLogic and so forth, and maybe how the current economic environment is starting to shift and influence those objectives.
Yeah, probably some objectives not dissimilar to others on the call here, as we've tried to navigate obviously what's been a unique market across the last 2 years, retaining top talent, investing in sort of hiring great talent has been an ongoing priority for us and remains so for 2022. One of the other big areas of focus is actually around acquisition integration. Last year, we acquired one of our major competitors and one of our primary business segments. And so through the back end of the year, going into early this year, we've been working through the integration of that business and ensuring that the organization is set to take advantage of the synergies that both bring and the market opportunities ahead.
Yeah, fantastic. In fact, maybe I could pick off on a couple of different threads that you mentioned there. One is kind of the talent dimension, and we're certainly here to talk a little bit about the role of the sales manager. So question one that I've got for you is, have you defined the role of the sales manager within HireLogic? And if so, what is that role and how have you defined it? Kind of question one. Second to that is, this acquisition. And, I know that when you acquire companies, you've got, 2 different operating environments. And curious how you've looked at both of those operating environments and that integration across those dimensions. Be interested to get your point of view on those two.
Yeah, absolutely. The sales manager is an interesting one, right? Because I speak to sales managers across my org, as well as many others externally, and there's definitely varying opinions as to the role that the sales manager should actually play. In my experience, it comes down to 3 core components. The first one is you're there to coach and develop the skills of your individual reps. You're there to try and make them better. Second one is you're there to remove obstacles cross-functionally across the organization to facilitate success. And then the final one is performance management, driving accountability across the organization. And in my experience at HireLogic and elsewhere, I actually think that the last 2 are probably more intuitive and people grasp that. It's ironic that the coaching and the development piece is one that sort of, I think people think they're doing, but when you scratch beneath the surface and really pressure test, they're actually not really doing it in practice. They're running one-on-ones, they're running the system. They're not really investing in coaching and developing their team. So that's been a big area of focus for us at HireLogic across the last couple of years.
How did you see that? Coaching is an interesting topic. It's a little this kind of amorphous, ambiguous concept, I think, in a lot of organizations. How did you get to the point or conclusion, if in fact you're there, to determine whether or not you were or you are not coaching?
Yeah, I think, actually, funny enough, sort of, there's a recent realization centered around this acquisition that we did, because as we brought these 2 organizations together, we were looking at the respective leaders across the business to determine sort of who fits in which role. And we were looking at the operating systems of the 2 organizations to determine, okay, what can we take from this one? What can we take from that one to sort of carve a positive path forward? And we had tried to define a sort of operating cadence, if you will, an operating system at HireLogic prior to the acquisition that we documented pretty well, was based on my experience as well as the experience of the managers. But when I started to dig into it, realized that there was a huge amount of variability across the business in terms of how managers are leading their individuals and how they're spending their time. And one of the big aha moments was that one around coaching, is that managers are actually not spending enough time coaching their teams. They're running these one-on-ones. They're actually thinking they're coaching and teaching individuals. In practice, they're not actually doing that. And we were actually seeing that play out in the performance distributions across our organizations, particularly as you looked at new hires and people in their first 12 to 18 months.
Fascinating. Let's press into this operating cadence here for a little bit and so forth. You talked a little bit about variability. Maybe you could just say a few more sentences in terms of the types of kind of concrete things that you saw in terms of, if I'm interpreting this right, one manager doing one thing and another manager arguably doing something else. And maybe you can speak a little bit to what the impact or efficacy was of those 2 managers.
Yeah, we had about 24 months ago, we had re-architected our operating system. So tried to separate pipeline meetings from forecast meetings, from more general sort of business one-on-ones, if you will, and check-ins with reps, and then set a new cadence for team meetings. And sort of, you can spot check calendars and see if folks have this penciled in. But it's hard to do that at scale and hard to do it on a sort of systematic basis. And when we brought the managers together and started to sort of have an open discussion around this, I realized that we'd sort of veered off the path that we'd set. So certain managers were only doing sort of 1 or 2 one-on-ones with their reps every month. And those were reps that actually needed the coaching and needed support. Other managers were spending all of their time with top performers, which is a nice place to be because you feel like you're winning all the time because these folks are doing well. And so the allocation and focus of time was a little bit all over the map. And I just stepped back and realized, like, we're actually not measuring this and managing this as an organization effectively. Managers are sort of taking from the sort of toolkit what they think works for them and sort of applying that in practice. But I can't see what's going on at the center and I can't measure it effectively. And ironically, that's about the time we got connected on this topic and started to dig into it a little bit together.
Yeah. Fascinating. As you can imagine, I'm excited to talk about this, aspect of visibility that you have into the operating cadence, or arguably lack thereof. As you think about the operating cadence, I'm curious. You're talking about one-on-ones. You're talking about deal reviews, QBRs, things of that nature. Richard, I'm getting a sense that it was very, if fair to say, kind of internally focused. How do you think about the concept of balancing, hey, I need my manager to be focused internally on pipeline review, forecast review, deal reviews, et cetera, versus, hey, bottom of your card actually says sales, I need you to be out in the marketplace, co-selling, call-alongs, ride-alongs. Curious to get a sense as to how you thought about that, number one, and did you see any variability amongst your managers across that particular dimension?
Yeah, the huge variability and again, ironic, I mean, differing opinions amongst our managers as to how much time they should actually be selling in the market with their reps. I had certain managers that were of the opinions that that's not really a domain where I'm going to spend much time. They bring me in at the tail end of a conversation to negotiate a deal or hold a discount, but that's where they get leverage from me in front of the customer. My time's better spent sort of monitoring pipeline, coming up with sales strategies to grow the business. Others were more sort of mentally attuned to it and spending more time there. But again, there was sort of huge variability. And I think as an organization, we documented this cadence, but to your point, it was very internally focused. It was focused on the meetings we hold internally, the one-on-ones, the QBRs, the cross-functional meetings with product and marketing. We weren't prescriptive at all about the time that managers should be spending in the market or where they should be spending their time, who they should be spending their time with. And so we were sort of just leaving that to them, assuming it was happening. But as we started to scratch beneath the surface and as we sort of got to grips with your software platform and implemented that, it was this aha moment. I was like, I've got managers that are spending less than 1% of their time in the field with reps on a week-by-week basis, which was pretty unnerving, if I'm honest.
Richard, I know that you're conversational intelligence customers, as is probably many of the listeners today that have dialed in and so forth. How do you think about balancing this concept? I mean, the ride-along has certainly changed. I mean, you might hear me say the call-along. We refer to it as co-selling, where you've got that just to try and bridge this interesting place we found ourselves. How do you think about the concept of the classic ride-along or call-along versus this new art form or management form of the call review? Any thoughts on that dimension?
Yeah, great question. We were a relatively early adopter of Gong, so we've had that as one of our sort of key sales tools for the last few years. And it's hugely valuable in many respects. It enables managers to manage at scale, understand patterns across sort of the calls that their teams are doing, particularly when they're managing large groups of individuals. And you configure it in a very customizable fashion. So it certainly has an important place to play in the sales ecosystem, but it doesn't substitute for co-selling, live selling in the field in the moment where you're there with a rep, you're working on sort of the pre-call prep, the setup for the call, you're in the call and then you're doing debrief and it's real time, it's raw and it's more impactful. And you can influence the outcome as a manager. Obviously, you want to teach these folks how to fish and be successful themselves, but there's an opportunity for you to engage with the customer, learn yourself, and ultimately influence the outcome and teach that rep how to architect a particular part of the sales conversation. And that's how I learned to sell. in the 90s, funnily enough, and sort of this is almost coming full circle, that CV was my first organization. And for the first 4 months, I traveled with other reps. I observed them. My manager traveled with me consistently. And we were there out in the field live, and the ramp to productivity was strong for the organization, and we developed a pretty effective selling organization. And so it's funny, you've got the sort of emergence of all these conversational tools and others that support. And I think many of us have veered away from this concept of co-selling or the ride-along and lost focus on that. But it's a pretty fundamental component of what we do. And this journey has sort of taught us, at Higher Logic at least, we really need to reinvest time in.
Thank you for that. And I know that we'll come back to different elements of that dimension here in just a minute. Richard, you started the call by talking a little bit about retaining talent and the operating cadence and the different, I'll use the term disciplines associated, the one-on-one, the pipeline review, the forecast review, the call along or the ride along. As you think about, those that are in the category of, voluntary, regrettable attrition, if I can characterize it that way, have you been able to understand the impact that potentially managers have or have not had on influencing that constituency within the Higher Logic?
The managers had a huge impact. I mean, I'll give you one example. At the tail end of last year, we lost a longtime manager who decided after 7 years with the business, quite understandably, time for a new challenge. I want to go and do something different. And in the subsequent 2 months, we lost the top 2 reps on that individual's team. Had that manager not left, I'm pretty convinced those reps would have stayed within the organization. So the managerial relationship, trying to instill continuity across the organization, I think is incredibly important. Of course, you're going to have managers lead, but if you've got a standardized operating system in place that everyone has faith in, the reps feel they're going to get equal support from manager A versus manager B, then you create some more certainty, I think, in your sales organization, and it only has to help you from a retention standpoint.
Yeah. So on that thread of, what are the characteristics of high performing managers, or, what the best managers inside of Higher Logic are doing, knowing that this is still kind of a work in progress, but you're starting to get a little bit more visibility, being able to measure it, have you been able to get it down to, I think we oftentimes start with these operating cadences like, here's all the, 50 things I need you to do. Have you started to kind of narrow it into, well, we might have, started with 50 things. Here are the 2, 3, 5 elements that matter most as you're thinking about the operating cadence coming into the second half of the year?
Yeah, we've sort of gone back to basics, as you might assume, because I think we just overcomplicated the system. So we've sort of scrapped the idea for now, separate forecast reviews, separate pipeline reviews. Actually, I do think there's a place for that, but the organization here at least needs to evolve before we get there. And so we've set a simple sort of marker around one-on-ones every week for certain tenure reps, certain performing segments of reps, those that are higher performing, higher tenured, every 2 weeks, and sort of an agreement and an alignment around that across the manager base. The big one that we focused on is co-selling, as you might imagine, based on what I've said earlier. And that's varied a little bit by manager, because some of our managers are managing 6 to 7, others are managing 10 to 11. So what you can actually do from a co-selling perspective varies a little bit. But I've seen a couple of managers that were spending less than 1% co-selling and have sat down with them and said, look, I want 10% of your time minimum each week. Assume 40 hours, although they typically work more than that, obviously. I want 4 hours of your time every week focused to co-selling in the field. Want it marked and logged in your calendar, so that you know that it's happening. I know that it's happening. We all feel good about it, and we feel that we're making progress against this dimension. So we've given each of the managers specific targets, and importantly, ensure that everything is documented in the calendar. Sort of the old adage of, if it's not in Salesforce, it doesn't exist. I've said to my managers, if it's not on your calendar, it doesn't exist. So let's commit to these one-on-ones. Let's commit to co-selling a certain portion of time per week, as well as some of the other sort of classic team meetings, training meetings, sales enablement meetings, marketing meetings, and so forth.
Mhm.
But we try to rationalize some of that stuff as well. We were just scheduling 1-hour meetings unnecessarily. We've tried to trim as many of our meetings to 30 minutes as possible to actually give managers time back in the calendar so that they can dedicate more time to these activities. It wasn't that our managers weren't busy, it's just they weren't focused on the right things.
Touche to you asking us to keep this to 30 minutes. So thank you for that. Appreciate that. You know, as we kind of narrow this in, and I'll turn it back to Jonathan here in just a minute, because I know there's a bunch of questions coming in. I'm seeing the different chat thing light up and so forth. So as you think about your managers, I know you and I talked a little bit about this offline, the assumptions that we've made that managers, once we ordain them to become a manager, are all knowing, omnipotent, like type of resources. And I'm curious if you could just speak to the actually how we coach and develop those that are developing others, and just the different profiles of managers that you have, and maybe going back to some of the assumptions you've made to say, actually, we need to be spending more time coaching those managers to help influence the team. Just curious if you could speak a little bit to that dimension.
Yeah, we've got a whole variety of managers, as you might assume, from first-time managers that have taken the step from sort of strong performing rep into the management role, to others that have been in the position for 10 to 15 years. And so we've got a sort of variety of experience. Although the irony I've seen is actually some of those more experienced managers are the ones that are, if it's the right word, the greatest offenders in terms of where they're spending their time. These are the ones that believe me, they're driving good outcomes for their organizations, for their teams, but they're not necessarily spending much time co-selling. They feel like they're past it, they're beyond it. They're certainly getting involved in big deals, complex negotiations, and so forth. But sort of the days of getting on a discovery call or a demo call with a rep to diagnose sort of capability and prescribe ideas for improvement have sort of moved on, and they're passing that across to sales enablement or somebody else. And as we looked at this, it's like, well, actually, that's a fundamental ingredient of the role. It doesn't matter if you've been doing it for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, we should all be doing it. If you look at some of the greatest coaches in sports, they still do what they did 10, 15 years ago. Those habits stay true. And that's a key component of teaching these folks how to coach effectively. And I think it's something that all of us as CSOs, CROs struggle with, and probably assume it's happening when in fact it's not.
Yeah. Thank you for that. You know, I think that whole aspect of qualification and starting, sooner in the funnel and top of the funnel to help and teach and coach, individual contributors, what should, continue to stay in the funnel, what should be disqualified out. Richard, thank you for that. Jonathan, thank you for magically appearing back into the frame here. I don't know how you did that, but back to you in terms of some of the questions that I know are coming up.
Yeah, a lot of questions, Richard, coming in for you. So I'm just going to grab a handful and fire them at you. So one of the questions that we're getting is this kind of idea that, hey, sounds like there's some interesting data you guys are looking at around where managers are spending their time, but it's new data that maybe you haven't looked at before. So how are you getting managers comfortable with collecting that data and utilizing that data within your organization?
Yeah, thanks for that, Jonathan. I mean, I think we've got to bring them on the journey. So I think when you start to inspect calendars and you start to sort of automate that measurement, if you will, people can get a little anxious around big brother micromanagement and trying to be caught out. And so as we've gone down this path, the first thing that we did was that let's bring the managers together and have an open, transparent dialogue. We're not trying to catch anyone out. We're all trying to get better as sales leaders. I'm trying to get better as a chief sales officer. And so what can we collectively learn about the system that we have today, its effectiveness, and the sort of path that we're on, and the improvements that we're trying to drive. So a lot of transparency in the process, trying to empower the managers. There's actually a book that Paul gave us, Pathways to Growth, that we used as a reading exercise with the group, brought the sales organization together actually with our CEO and Paul, and we had a very open dialogue about the learnings from that book, the evolution of sales in the last 20 years, and sort of the next phase of sales leadership and the sales profession. And that was a good catalyst for getting people comfortable with the direction that we were taking and this path that we're on.
Thank you, Richard. Another question that we're getting is just kind of curiosity around the setup of this, collecting the data. how fast, how easy was it for you to begin to start to see some of these insights?
Pretty quick. I mean, within a matter of weeks. So it's simply a case of getting the manager calendars connected to the software tool, and then getting the performance data in the system so that you can correlate sort of the performance of individuals to the managers that are managing them and the time allocation of that manager. So I would say within a month, we had some pretty interesting insights around where managers were spending time, who were they spending their time with, and that enabled us to quickly make adjustments.
Got it. Hey, the last question I've got for you is people are asking about, okay, great, you can see some of this data. What changes have you seen regarding manager behavior since managers have now become more self-aware around where they're spending their time?
I think actually the word self-awareness is a good one. There's a concept called the Hawthorne effect that folks may be familiar with, which relates to sort of as you become aware of a concept or an idea, you actually just by default start to change your behavior as a result. And we definitely saw that play out across our sales organization. So beyond some of the prescriptions that we made, which I'll talk about in a moment, just this awareness that we need to be more purposeful and effective in our allocation of time has led our management team to be more thoughtful in terms of what are they doing each and every day, and actually be a little bit more selfish in terms of the utilization of their time. So they're applying their effort to higher value activities. Beyond that, I talked earlier with Paul, I think it's the big area of focus has been co-selling and trying to get individuals. I have had a couple of managers who were less than 1% of their time was in the market with their team. And we moved those individuals to 10% across the last quarter. So they're now spending at least 10% of their time co-selling with their teams. And they seem to be enjoying their jobs more as a result, funny enough, as I engage with them, as we dissect deals, as we look at the forecast, they're definitely closer to their business. And they seem to be more animated. So ironically, these adjustments are, I think, are leading to sort of higher levels of manager satisfaction at the same time.
Hey, Richard, on behalf of Paul, I want to thank you for spending a few minutes with us. And I'm just going to grab the screen back and kind of wrap us up and get everyone out on the rest of their day. So let me go ahead and share my screen one more time. And hey, guys, we want to leave you with one tactic that we think everyone on the call can implement to improve operational excellence. And again, a little bit of a background as to what Richard's been talking about. When we think about this operating cadence, it starts with how we understand where managers are spending their time. And that was, what Richard was speaking to in terms of collecting some of those insights. The next thing that we look at is kind of beginning to say, hey, where should we spend time? And, Richard talked about this idea of, hey, we really need to be spending more time co-selling. So let's get more deliberate about that. And then just like anything, we got to watch it. We got to monitor it, understand how it's behaving and make the right adjustments. And that's something that, when we have data around it, we actually have the ability to do that. And, it starts to look as follows. So this is a high level view, but, beginning to break out where managers are spending their time in one-on-ones, team meetings, co-selling, call reviews, some of the specific activities that we begin to categorize on the calendar. And one of the fundamental insights that we've uncovered is really that, when we correlate those activities and events and where managers are spending their time versus the performance that they're generating, high performing managers are spending, call it 200%, 3x more time co-selling, and they're getting a hell of a lot more sellers actually to their numbers. So these are not small numbers in terms of the impact that we're seeing. They're pretty demonstrable in terms of, hey, if we can get more managers in the market with their teams, actually creating a pretty significant impact based on the data that we're collecting. So again, we've kept you in suspense, in terms of the one sales management intelligence tactic that we believe can have a real improvement around operational excellence and improve the return on sales manager time. Hopefully it's not going to come as a huge surprise at this moment, but is setting up a consistent co-sell motion. And again, as we walk into an organization, we collect some of these insights. This is typically what we find. It's not inconsistent from what Richard was just sharing a moment ago. We've got some managers that are co-selling and some managers that aren't co-selling and kind of interpreting it pretty differently. And it is having an impact in terms of how sellers are actually being able to be successful in their role. And it's this one adjustment that we believe is the one operational improvement that every organization can implement, just in terms of understanding where managers are spending time, that can have a real impact in terms of seller productivity, obviously getting more sellers to their number. And who doesn't want that in the current operating environment that we find ourselves in? So with that, I want to thank everyone for taking a few minutes with us today. And if you want to learn more about sales management intelligence, feel free to set up a time and we'll spend some more time with you. Thanks so much. Bye.